the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, August 18th, 2015. Military whistleblower Chelsea Manning faces indefinite solitary confinement for absurd-sounding charges. Evan Greer with Fight for the Future will explain what's happening. And as California's drought continues, Connor Everts, Southern California Watershed Alliance's head, will join us in studio to discuss shade balls, forest fires, the water bond, and desalination. Plus, Jon C. Mutter will discuss his new book, The Disaster Profiteers, How Natural Disasters Make the Rich Richer and the Poor Poorer. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
22 people were killed and 123 injured yesterday when a bomb detonated in Bangkok, Thailand at a religious shrine. The target of the deadly bombing was a tourist spot. The Thai government has accused a militant group in the northeastern part of the country as being responsible. New CCTV footage of a man believed to be the bomber was released to news media. And while it's difficult to make out the man's features, he's wearing a yellow t-shirt and glasses and apparently took off a large backpack and walked off. Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha called the bombing, quote, the worst incident that has ever happened in Thailand. Last year, Thailand was rocked by protests that led to a change in government. Bob, what do you make of the government's response to this incident?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about what this might be. And at this point, I don't think we know much of anything. Of course, there's a separatist movement in the south, a Muslim movement in the ethnic Malay territory, but no one's really, even in the Thai government, suggesting they're responsible. There's speculation that concern over the deportation of some Uyghurs to China might have inspired this, but it's really hard to make any sense of this whatsoever. We know that there's been a resistance to the populist surge in Thailand over the last couple of decades, really, and that military coups have been pretty standard. But I'm just not clear on what's behind this, and I think it'll be interesting to see if there is a clear explanation that emerges. I don't have one right now, that's for sure.
The Obama administration has just issued the final permit to Royal Dutch Shell to drill in the Arctic. The Interior Department issued the permit yesterday despite major protests in the states of Washington and Oregon over the past several months. Earlier, Shell was allowed only to drill on the edges of oil zones, but now, because it has fulfilled a government condition to have the right kind of emergency vehicle on hand, the final permit was issued, allowing Shell to drill into the heart of Arctic oil areas. The Chukchi Sea, where Shell wants to drill, is home to a pristine and very fragile environment. Activists are deeply concerned that drilling will disrupt the livelihoods of indigenous communities as well as marine life. Oil spills in the region, which are inevitable, will be impossible to clean up. Shell's permit was approved within weeks of President Obama making a major speech on climate change. Well, I guess, Bob, we shouldn't be surprised in the least bit over this news, right?
Right. This is one on which I have a clear evaluation. This is an insane decision. To start drilling in environmentally sensitive places is crazy. To start drilling and expanding drilling in general is crazy. There are some basic things we know: that we have to stop building coal-fired power plants, we have to stop building any new nuclear plants, and we have to stop this exploration for oil in environmentally sensitive places. But in a way, this isn't surprising. Remember, this is part of Obama's all of the above energy strategy, which is just a polite way of saying we're going to keep expanding the search for fossil fuels. If you look at the Obama all of the above strategy, you'll note that the first goal of it is economic growth, which means that this is a disaster. Whether or not there's a spill, the entire policy is a disaster.
And finally, Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's recent meeting with activists from Black Lives Matter is now public record. A video recording of last week's private meeting with 3 activists in New Hampshire was obtained by a website called Good, as well as by MSNBC. Just as some BLM members have publicly confronted candidate Bernie Sanders, these activists attempted to reach Clinton but were not allowed into her event. She met with them privately instead, and during the exchange they told her that her husband, former President Bill Clinton, was responsible for much of the mass incarceration impacting African Americans. Organizer Donasia Yancey told MSNBC in an interview afterwards that, quote, her response wasn't sufficient for us. Julius Jones, who was also present at the meeting with Clinton, added, quote, at the same time, she was also ducking personal responsibility for the role that her and her family played in it, too, end of quote. Now, Bob, many pro-Sanders people were angry with Black Lives Matter for not going after Clinton, so clearly they are targeting all candidates, and some of them even confronted Jeb Bush. What do you make of their tactics?
Well, whether or not the disruption of the Bernie Sanders event was a smart tactic or not is really irrelevant at this point. It happened, and the question is how to go forward for the movement to increase the visibility of these issues. I think it's very smart to target Clinton because remember, not only Bill Clinton, who has a horrendous record on race, but Hillary Clinton herself has not been terribly predictable about this. Remember in the 2008 election or primary against Obama, the Hillary Clinton campaign sent Bill Clinton out to race bait. So I think putting pressure on Hillary Clinton is important. The Obama administration has made some good first steps about ending this insane mass incarceration policy, correcting the problems of harsh sentencing. And I think the real question is to make sure that that goes forward, that a Clinton candidacy doesn't step back from that, and if it's a Clinton presidency, that it goes forward. So I think this kind of pressure on the Clinton campaign is really important.
Well, Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. One of the world's most well-known military whistleblowers, Chelsea Manning, is facing the prospect of indefinite solitary confinement. At a disciplinary hearing today, Manning faces 4 alleged violations of U.S. Army policy. They include keeping a tube of toothpaste past its expiry date and owning a copy of Vanity Fair, the issue featuring Caitlyn Jenner on the cover. Manning is serving a 35-year sentence at the military prison in Fort Leavenworth for revealing documents about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to WikiLeaks. A day after she was sentenced, she announced her decision to transition from male, when she was known as Bradley Manning, to female. The group Fight for the Future has launched a petition against putting her in solitary confinement. As of this interview, well over 100,000 people have signed it. And one of the organizers behind the petition is my guest, Evan Greer. She's a campaign director at Fight for the Future. Welcome to Uprising, Evan.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for joining us. Now, where do you think this is coming from? Why would Chelsea Manning be targeted for a disciplinary hearing over such trivial issues like having a magazine in her possession and letting a toothpaste expire by like a few months? It expired in like April.
You know, I wish that I could say that I was totally shocked by these new charges, but what the military is doing to Chelsea right now is basically par for the course. Chelsea has already been tortured by the U.S. government while she was awaiting her initial trial, held in extreme conditions of solitary confinement, having her clothing taken away at night, and a number of other things that were essentially designed to dehumanize, break her down, and try to break her spirit. And I can actually, the thing I'm happy to report today is that that hasn't been working. Supporters have been talking to Chelsea on a regular basis. She's very strong. And while she is facing these new charges, and they do seem to be an attempt to silence her voice, I don't think that that's going to work. Chelsea has a strong voice, and she deserves to be able to speak out and have the freedom to do so.
And how has she been speaking out? It is pretty impressive that she's been able to access social media, even be a writer for The Guardian and other outlets.
Chelsea works very hard at these things, and she is very careful to clear everything with the prison that she's doing. She basically speaks to supporters on the phone, who are then able to put out messages on social media on her behalf. And then, I believe she communicates with The Guardian through mail. So she does have some of the basic rights that many military prisoners do have. And she's actually risks potentially losing some of those abilities to communicate with the outside world if she's punished with solitary confinement, which again, the United Nations says that more than 15 days of solitary confinement is considered a form of torture. Chelsea's facing potentially indefinite solitary confinement for the rest of her 35-year sentence.
So she has been charged, in addition to owning or having in her possession a magazine and a tube of expired toothpaste. She's also been charged with, quote, disrespect during mealtime and sweeping food crumbs on the floor. Either these are trumped up charges that are targeting her for her speaking out and using her voice, or these are standard kinds of things that you see in military prisons, which wouldn't surprise us either, given how poor the rights of prisoners are in general, whether in military prisons, federal prisons, or state prisons.
That's absolutely correct. And I think it is important that people understand that, unfortunately, what's happening to Chelsea is not an aberration. There are more than 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States at any given time. Prisoners, not only in military prisons, but in all prisons, face punitive measures from correctional staff who may just have a personal vendetta against them or other reasons to harass them. Transgender prisoners in particular face these types of abuses, and particularly solitary confinement, on a disproportionate level. So the things that are happening to Chelsea are terrible, and they're clearly based on, as you said, either trumped up charges or just a blatant attempt to silence her voice. But unfortunately, it's also part of a broader, widespread epidemic in U.S. prisons of using solitary confinement as a form of control.
Now, Evan, Manning released a photo of herself from February, just before her hormone therapy began. She's also released the charging documents, so she is keeping her story alive. The fact that she is basically going to be held for years in a male prison as she transitions is also a very important aspect of her struggle, is it not?
Absolutely, and it's also the case for the vast majority of transgender prisoners. They're held in facilities that are not appropriate for their gender identity and for their actual gender, and that leads to a variety of risks for different people. Chelsea is fighting for her basic rights to healthcare as a person, as a human, as a transgender person, and that's an ongoing fight. And I do think it's also, again, notable in this case, the way the military is treating her is unfortunately not unique, but it does seem very clearly targeted. And the fact that some of the materials that they took from her and claimed were contraband were basic LGBT-related reading material, like the Vanity Fair issue with Caitlyn Jenner on the cover, is particularly disturbing and paints a grim picture that the military is not only targeting her for her voice, but also targeting her as a transgender woman.
Now, she, I understand, was also being denied access to the legal library where she was being held. How was she supposed to prepare for this hearing that's happening right now as we speak?
That's correct. So the one important thing to understand about this hearing is that Chelsea will not have access to legal representation. She's going before a board of 3 people who essentially get to decide what punishment she will face, if any. And again, the maximum punishment in this case could be indefinite solitary confinement. She won't have an attorney. She needs to represent herself. And over the weekend, she was denied access at a regularly scheduled time to the legal library, where she could have gained access to materials to prepare a defense for herself. The military later admitted that this was "quote unquote" a mistake, and she was able to gain access on Sunday, but she lost about half the amount of time that she should have had to prepare for this. And again, it's hard to say whether this was just an inconvenient, just a sort of a fluke or something more targeted. But just the overall treatment of Chelsea in this case, I think, should be raising eyebrows at every instance where she is not afforded her basic rights.
Now, Evan, what about the petition, which I understand just went up a few days ago? This morning, I checked, over 101,000 people that have signed it yesterday, getting close to 100,000. That is a pretty impressive number of people. Can that have any impact on this three-person panel?
It's definitely a massive response. In less than a week, more than 100,000 people spoke out, demanding that Chelsea's hearing today be open to the press and the public, and demanding that the military drop these frivolous charges against her. Obviously, the U.S. military is not Congress, but they are supposed to be accountable, and they are supposed to be protecting these basic freedoms. That's what they allegedly are supposed to be doing. And so I think they should respond to this petition. They should respond to more than 100,000 people calling out and saying that this is wrong. And at the very least, they should open Chelsea's hearing to the press and the public. The military put out a statement claiming that they're committed to fairness in Chelsea's case. And if that were the truth, then they should have no problem allowing us to see these proceedings as they go on, if they're truly committed to fairness.
Well, certainly it can't hurt, I think, to alert the military that there are lots of people watching these sorts of issues, definitely benefit from the light of day, or just at least from scrutiny, even if we don't have transparency. Finally, in the long term, when is Chelsea Manning eligible for parole? Are these disciplinary hearings possibly laying the groundwork for denying her parole when she becomes eligible, just to be able to say, well, you haven't served as a model prisoner?
I think that would be a question better asked to Chelsea's attorneys. I'm not super familiar with how that could all play out. But what I will say is that overall, the parole system for both military prisoners and prisoners at large is completely broken. And many, many people who do deserve to get parole are denied it over totally ridiculous things like what Chelsea's facing now. So while I'm not sure exactly how this will play out in Chelsea's case, it absolutely is the case that parole boards on the whole do not afford prisoners their basic rights, often deny parole to people who deserve it. And these types of disciplinary issues that can come up in prisons that totally lack transparency or due process, I believe, can impact those decisions in the end.
Finally, Evan, give out a website where people can find out more information, and when will we find out the results of the hearing?
Hopefully we will hear from Chelsea shortly after her hearing today. Again, this is a non-transparent hearing. Her attorneys won't be present. The media won't be present. So the only way we'll know what comes out of this hearing is when Chelsea calls one of her supporters. People can follow what's going on with Chelsea by following her on Twitter. That's actually the best thing that I would recommend. She's at XYChelsea, and again, her supporters tweet word for word things that she calls and asks them to tweet. So that's actually her voice that you can follow. And you can also sign the petition or get updates at freechelsea.com, which is a website set up by us at Fight for the Future. So follow her on Twitter, XYChelsea, or go to freechelsea.com to sign the petition and learn more.
And then Fight for the Future's own website is fightforthefuture.org. Evan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Have a great day.
You too. My guest is Evan Greer. She is a campaign director at Fight for the Future, one of the organizations leading the fight for the rights of Chelsea Manning, the whistleblower known for handing over documents related to the Iraq and Afghanistan war to WikiLeaks. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The city of Los Angeles recently publicized its latest effort to combat drought, and the bizarre nature of that effort went viral. About 20,000 4-inch black plastic balls were dumped into the LA reservoir, part of an effort to combat the effects of a debilitating drought in California. A total of 96 million so-called shade balls have been released into joining reservoirs. This is a $34 million effort. The plastic balls, which are hollow and contain potable water, are supposed to be inert. They will apparently reduce water loss through evaporation and block chemical reactions triggered by sunlight that release toxic substances. But the photo op and Twitter jokes generated by the shade balls in LA's reservoirs obscure the larger and ongoing problem of how the nation's most populous state is dealing with water shortage. Questions surround a water bond approved by voters last year. Meanwhile, forest fires rage throughout the state in southern, central, and northern California. Joining me in studio today is Connor Everts. He is the co-chair of the Southern California Watershed Alliance. Welcome to Uprising, Connor.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, before we get into the bigger issues, let's talk about these shade balls that have generated much controversy around the country because of these photos. I think that the photo op that Mayor Eric Garcetti was hoping for might have backfired a little bit. I don't like to drink water out of a plastic bottle that's been sitting in my car, heating the water and leaching chemicals from the plastic into the water. Why would I want to drink water from a reservoir in which millions of black plastic balls have been cooking in the sun?
So, we pick on the small things that are happening here, and I saw Mayor Garcetti trying to toss one of those balls out into the reservoir, and I thought that was amusing. The issue is evaporation and how we deal with it. So I think actually that plastic's relatively inert. It's what's put in milk bottles. I'm no great lover of plastic. I'd like to see a world without plastic, not only the impacts of it, but also the impacts of producing it as well. Nevertheless, I think that's really a small issue in the greater issues we have around water. It's part of the issues that we actually have open reservoirs. We haven't covered them. There are view sheds for a lot of people, especially in well-to-do areas like Bel Air. And so they want to put the shade balls in so they don't have to completely cover it. So that's a compromise they've made. So the evaporation will pay off over time. We assume they're testing the water quality for this as well.
Forgive me for staying on this issue for just a little bit before we get into those larger issues. What happens when the balls start to degrade? I mean, as anyone with kids know.
So I actually just read, and there's actually interesting graphic on Business Times, and you can look it up on the web. If people want more information, it breaks it down. So by 10 years, they consider their life is over. So this investment's a 10-year investment. They then pull them out and replace them again.
You pull out millions of little plastic balls, just pull them
Actually,
out.
not that. They're larger than I thought.
Inches,
yeah. They're fairly large, bigger than a handball. And then they pull them out and then they start all over again.
Wow.
It is funny how we deal with these issues about water. In any way, we look at water and what California does. There's a high level of absurdity. This one's minor compared to the others.
The absurd factor is high, but the actual importance factor is low, is what you're saying?
No, I think it's important that we cover our reservoirs and we don't evaporate. We have open aqueducts that run hundreds of miles and they're not covered and we're evaporating a lot of water. The idea of new dams and climate change doesn't make any sense because they'll evaporate 5 to 10% with hotter, drier, windier times. So evaporation is a very real issue. That's why we want to put water back in the ground. That's why we want to clean up our aquifers here in LA and the San Fernando Valley. Those are the real issues we should be talking about.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because the technology is actually widely used. I think that the mayor was going for a photo op, but it might have generated more questions than he intended for it to generate. Let's turn to what the state is doing about its drought. Last year, a majority of California voters passed an ambitious water bond that was supposed to put billions of dollars into improving the infrastructure of our drinking water supply and protect it. Has that started to happen?
On a very small scale. However, they're already talking about a new multi-billion-dollar water bond, and we haven't even started to spend what we had, unfortunately.
Wasn't it like 7 point something billion dollars?
$7.545 billion. There's some carryover from previous ones as well. The unfortunate thing is, it was sold as helping the drought and did anything but. It only had $250 million in it statewide for ag and urban water conservation. There is some money for watersheds. There's some money for cleaning up the aquifers. There's some money for disadvantaged communities. Those almost 2 million people in California don't have access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water before the drought. The reality is in 2010, 2011, we had a very wet winter. The reservoirs filled. Into 2012, we actually had water. The aquifers could have been coming back up, but as we went into a historically dry drought, we didn't have any triggers. And so we emptied down all the reservoirs. So the issue isn't really just this drought might end with an El Nino or not. It's we structurally have to change how we deal with water in California.
So if the majority of the money from last year's water bond was not focused on things like agricultural use or urban water use, or even to provide water to 2 million people who need it, what was it meant for?
So 2.7 billion out of the 7.5 billion goes directly to what they call storage, and that was really meant for dams, and that was the deal to get the Republicans on board and get everybody to sign on to it. The drought also pushed a bond that had been too big to pass previously. We've been fighting for years. I'd supported previous bonds in the past, but the money's not really trickling down to the communities that really need it and to the issues that really need it. And that's how do we reduce our demand. If we do that now and we use drought as an opportunity, then we've really changed the way we think of water. Instead of ever more supply, whether it be dams or aqueducts or ocean desalination, which doesn't make sense, we actually get down to the focus of it, like Australia did with a 12-year drought, where they use a fraction of the water we do. They're far more efficient. They've changed their way of life and how they think about water. They capture rainwater when it does rain. And if they can keep their rugby fields green, they're happy.
Okay, so the money, most of it hasn't, I mean, they've just started to spend it. But you're saying that there's now talk of a new water bond. Why is there talk of a new water bond when there's money that hasn't been spent?
Historically, that's the way we've done things. The legislators pat themselves on the back when I think it was 1.1 billion they allocated for the drought. That was pulling from a 2006 flood control bond that hadn't been spent. So this is the way this works. It's very hard for government to move the money out. They actually have to evaluate, as they should, what are the proper projects. Because we don't have any set of loading order, as they call electricity, or priorities for water, we don't have a matrix how to make these decisions.
So why not
everyone
wait
applies.
till the money is starting to get used and then introduce another water bond if it is needed? Is it just that people think, or lawmakers are thinking, because a drought is foremost in people's minds, it's a useful time to get voters to say yes to another possible bond?
You got it, Sonali. It's political.
Wow.
And water in this state is more about politics and money, and it runs uphill towards money. And that's one of the big problems we're having here. So the big engineering firms, the consulting firms, what we call the hydrological brotherhood, are determining where we should go rather than people. And it's people who save water, not the agencies. And people are saving water and coming up with all kinds of innovative ideas.
On their own.
On their own and with incentives.
Right,
But
and
unfortunately, the incentives,
let's talk about that.
which there was a tsunami of response, not only from the media, but from the public.
So these are incentives for people to, for example, transform their lawns into drought-friendly, buy water-efficient toilets and dishwashers or laundry or clothes washers, washing machines.
Right.
How much have people taken advantage of those incentives, and has that then in turn caused lawmakers to pull back the incentives?
Yeah, they were too
Yes and yes?
yes and yes. They were too successful, quite frankly. But the main focus was on turf replacement, and they were just throwing money at it without any determination of the best way of doing it.
Right.
So we had some companies that were just living off the rebates, who then laid off 400 people after they had gone up to 600.
Wow.
They were there before the drought. They were advertising. They were in a good place. However, the end result was a very short-term burst based on that incentive, which was then pulled away. There's still incentives, to be clear, to do all the other things you were talking about, replacing appliances. They keep getting more efficient every year. You know, we went from 7-gallon toilets to 3.5 to 1.6, now 1.2, 0.8. We have waterless urinals. There are all kinds of options that are changing. That level of technology changes very quickly, and that's very encouraging. Same with showers. We're seeing stuff that's more efficient, feels better, and even than a generation ago. That money's still available, but only at $1.95 an acre foot. We talk about water supply. 1/3 of a million gallons, or a football field a foot deep, is an acre foot, about 326,000 gallons. So that is still available, but only at $1.95. But technologies that don't make sense right now in California, like desalination, get at $370 an acre foot.
And I want to talk about desalination, but before we do that, one of the things that I think we have to keep reminding ourselves is that this drought, the length of the drought, the severity of the drought, the fact that we just had a huge heat wave and we're experiencing these massive forest fires throughout the state. These are all hallmarks of a changing climate. Even if we might get temporary relief from our drought, the fact is, unless we do something as a society, as a planet, very quickly to curb climate change, we need to adapt for the long haul while we reduce our fossil fuel footprint, right?
That's totally right. We need to adapt, and we need to look at the long view. And so all the things you mentioned are what we expect in climate change, is these extremes, and sometimes in the wrong time, in the wrong place. So Tucson gets flash floods, right? We get these monsoonal rains. We should be deploying for an El Nino that eventually will come and be ready to capture water locally. But our whole baseline of how we did things in the last century were big engineering projects to bring water hundreds of miles away. It may be very different. We may get more water where the people are along the coast, and that's what happened in the Bay Area last December and February. They ended up with 131% of normal, but we weren't prepared to capture it. So we need to decentralize water, and people are doing that. I mean, I have a little system where I capture rainwater, gray water, compost, and I have a little tiny balcony, and I can grow tomatoes and peppers, and I can get all the water I need just there on site without it running off into the ground, polluting and running into the ocean. Everybody is doing things like that. It's really amazing. In terms of lawns, as the governor said when he stood there and there was no snowpack and there was supposed to be 6 to 7 feet, and he then announced a 25% cutback statewide by the end of February. He said that little patch of green in the front of your house is a thing of the past. Well, that is becoming true, but we should continue the incentives for that because that's a good investment. And we should make real choices on how we can capture water. Each home could be a watershed. We can lower the level of the lawn so it doesn't shed water off and create pollution. We can create little swales, little hills and depressions, put gravel in the right place to capture
Mulch
water.
it and
Do all these things and think of your yard as something very different than we have in the
Right.
past. And people want to do that.
for those people even with
The
yards.
Arboretum is giving drought gardening classes. The change is happening. This is a cultural change. It's really a revolution in water that's happening. And the agencies sell water, so they don't really want this to work.
Right. Now, so let's talk about the issue of desalination. We as a society have gotten dependent on this idea of magic bullets, and that technology will just save us out of every fix. I grew up in the United Arab Emirates, where most of our water for decades has been the result of desalination, because that's a part of the country, of the world rather, that it doesn't have access to fresh water. It's also a very rich country. This costs a lot of water, but it's also a very tiny country. So in California, and I understand that there's one major desalination plant in Carlsbad.
Not finished yet, but they're still building it.
That they're building. The idea of desalination is taking ocean water and essentially extracting fresh water out of it, which is a very energy-intensive project, but also that then salty byproduct is simply pushed back into the ocean, which in the long term can't be a good idea. Is that sort of the main crux of what's wrong with desalination?
Well, the first thing is we don't need it. So before Australia, Spain, Israel did desal, they got their water demand to a fraction of what we are, 30 to 50 gallons per day per person. We're well over 100 statewide. Some areas.
Let me just stop you there. Let's reiterate that. In Australia and other countries, people use 30 to 50 gallons per person. In California, we're still using about 100 gallons.
Well over
100 gallons per person.
Per day.
Per day.
Now, that's not literally people's individual usage. It's
average.
usually the turf and the outside. But there's some areas that are using over 400 or 500 gallons per day per person.
Right.
Rancho Santa Fe was a good example. So
Now, this doesn't include agricultural consumption, which is,
no,
of
it doesn't,
course,
which
huge.
is also 80% of our developed water. And desalination, to be quite clear, is really about new development along the coast. It's not for agriculture. There's high levels of boron that impact both killing plants and human reproductive health. So there's water quality issues, as you mentioned. It's energy intensive, the most energy intensive source of water, more than pumping water over the Tehachapi. So if we want to reduce greenhouse gas and limit the impacts, we're doing the opposite with that. So the other thing that doesn't make sense is that the brine discharge doesn't break down. It sits on the bottom and has an impact on marine life. A lot of studies gone on in the Monterey Bay for that. We had about 32 projects. Now we have maybe 5 that are at some level of discussion or moving forward. Communities have voted it down. Marin, Santa Cruz voted it down. But because of drought, Santa Barbara, which built one 25 years ago, it sat idle because we went to El Nino. It's going to start all over again. Same thing in Australia. Australia built 6 multi-billion-dollar plants. 4 out of 6 are all sitting idle, but you still have to pay for them.
And so these are very large projects, and that's always, in the end, it always comes down to a small group of elites excited about making money off of a disaster, which incidentally is the topic of our next interview in a few minutes.
I do want to mention something, though, because this is really about privatization of water,
Yeah.
and it's taking the ocean, which is a public trust, and that we want to maintain a fisheries in it, and it's trying to suck in water the old-fashioned way in power plants, which are getting shut
Just
down.
taking it, yeah.
But Poseidon, the main speculator on this, the company
the
that's
company.
doing Carlsbad and wants to do Huntington Beach, wants to use that old-fashioned way rather than pushing the water through the sand. So we get a discussion about technology, but my comment about desal is it's not the technology stupid. What we really have to do is get our demand down before we even talk about that. We should be 55 gallons per day per person for equity across the whole state, and then we wouldn't have these inequities we have between different communities. And people have a real opportunity this week. I'm going from here to the Metropolitan Water District at noon. They're having a discussion about a parcel tax. They have the right to put your property taxes and extract money from you without you knowing about it, essentially. They're paying off the State Water Project, the one that runs along the 5 and has been there since the 60s. They were about to eliminate that, but they're trying to maintain it that high level for their next project, which we've talked about before, which is the Delta Tunnel boondoggle of building
Yes.
gigantic tunnels. It doesn't make any sense. With climate change, there isn't water for it. The other one is on Wednesday, the California Water Commission is actually coming to Southern California rather than Sacramento. They're the ones that make decisions which way the money could be spent for good watershed projects or for bad dam projects, for groundwater cleanup like we have in the San Fernando Valley, or for dams in the Sierra, which will most of the time be dry slabs. That's at 9:30, and people can go to that. Met doesn't pay for your parking, but it's worth the price of admission otherwise.
Thank you so much, Connor, for joining us today and for doing all the work you do.
Thank you for the opportunity.
My guest is Connor Everts. He is the co-chair of the Southern California Watershed Alliance. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Disasters make for great headlines. They help publishers sell more newspapers and TV networks sell more ads. They generate public sympathy for charities and enable politicians to appear benevolent. But in the quiet aftermath, after the attention fades, they're simply the precursors to bigger, slower-moving disasters. Author Jon C. Mutter, in his new book, lays out how elites have taken advantage of natural disasters to consolidate greater power, leaving poor people more helpless than before. Mutter examines disasters in the Caribbean, Myanmar, and New Orleans as case studies. Jon C. Mutter is a professor at Columbia University in the Departments of Earth and Environmental Sciences and in International and Public Affairs. He is the former deputy director of the Earth Institute and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His book is called The Disaster Profiteers: How Natural Disasters Make the Rich Richer and the Poor Poorer. Welcome to Uprising, Jon.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, one of the things that makes your book unique is that you're a scientist who's tried to study natural disasters from a social scientist view, not just a natural scientist view. Can you explain that a little bit more? Why it's important to study, as social scientists, the aftermath of natural disasters?
Yeah, well, if you think of what a disaster is compared with, say, a natural hazard or a movement of the earth, a sort of paroxysm of the earth, disaster really means something with a social context. If there was an earthquake in the middle of Siberia where there was nobody, it would be an interesting physical phenomenon, but not a social phenomenon. It wouldn't be a disaster. So the very fact that we give it the name disaster means that it's the subject for social scientists, not just natural scientists.
There's been, you say in your book that it is human nature more than Mother Nature, if you will, nature that makes disasters so terrible. What do you mean by that?
So, for instance, you can have a relatively modest earthquake, something around magnitude 5 that I know is fairly common in California. And in California, you'd have from 0 to possibly 100 deaths. The same magnitude earthquake in a poor country will create thousands of deaths. If you think of the difference between, say, Haiti and other countries, for instance, Chile, that have had similarly sized earthquakes with vastly different social outcomes. So you do need to be thinking about the nature of the society, the nature of how it's governed, the institutions, its history, its relationship with its neighbors. All of those things come into play when you're asking what happened as a result of that event.
And I want to get to that a little bit later, but there's this idea that societies can benefit from natural disasters, that even if they're horribly destructive in the immediate aftermath, when masses of people die, that somehow we can see or treat natural disasters as opportunities for long-term changes. Is that actually true? Does the evidence show that societies can benefit from natural disaster?
Well, there's good theory, and it goes sort of like this. So in the immediate aftermath, there'll be a lot of rebuilding, and a lot of building contractors will benefit, but that's short-lived. That's just putting things back. However, if you think about many poor places, there will be some strong infrastructure, some good buildings, often government buildings, typically surrounded by peri-urban slums and poor infrastructure. Most natural disasters will preferentially destroy the older, weaker, less efficient infrastructure and other building stock. If you are able to replace that with loans from the World Bank or gifts, if ideally, and you replaced what was there with something that had better capacity. So think of, you had an old port that could handle a certain amount of shipping, a few containers a day, say, and you were able to replace that with a modern port that could handle big container ships, then your ability to import and export manufactured goods and other things would be enhanced, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And you could think of that for airports and hospitals that would improve, human welfare, and schools that would improve education, roads and bridges and train lines. If you can do it, you can, in theory, create a longer term benefit. Now, the only times I've seen that reasonably well documented has been in moderate to high income countries, places where a lot of the infrastructure is insured. So what you replace is naturally better than what was there before, just because it's newer. You buy something new when you buy something on your insurance. In poorer places that are not insured, where people want to get back to life and work quickly, I've not seen evidence of that that type of benefit happening. Not to the general population, anyway.
You describe disasters in your book as having three phases. Phase one, which is pre-disaster, when societies are supposed to be preparing. Phase two, which is when disaster strikes. Phase three, the aftermath of disasters. And when you have, as you were saying earlier, when you have poorer countries where disasters strike and they have a much greater impact, such as in Haiti, than they might in, say, California, how do elites take advantage of societies reeling from the aftermath?
Well, what happens in many places is that they'll sort of draw up a plan for a new city. They'll say, well, what we would really have liked to have done a little slum clearing ourselves, but there's been social resistance to that. Now nature has come along and cleared the slums. So the people in power will say, we will draw up a plan to revitalize the city, urban renewal. There's all sorts of buzzwords that go with this. And instead of bringing the slums back, we'll put golf courses or, nice things for nice people. And we'll essentially remove the problem people from the problem places simply by not letting them come back, because those places will have been declared blighted or unsuitable for housing. Now, what happens to the displaced people is seemingly of no concern to the city planners. Those people have been displaced, and it's going to be very difficult for them to get back. So they've achieved a sort of social upgrade at the hand of nature. They've taken advantage of that event to do what they would have liked to have done anyway.
Is it fair to say that disasters can simply cause poverty?
I think they can exacerbate the differences that are already there in societies. And I actually heard from a guy on a different radio show lived in New Orleans. He was not poor, but he was a middle income type of person. And after Katrina, he said he had dropped a full social class, that he had been doing not terrifically, but well enough. And afterwards, he was just struggling. He didn't get money from the government. He had to use his savings to repair his house. And he was a social class lower than he had been before. And certainly, if you're close to poverty, a disaster can put you there. It doesn't mean that the disaster itself will hold you in that place. It's the trigger that shoves you there.
Let's talk about what we now need to happen and how you think the disasters should be approached from your research and from learning what you have learned. Is it just that everyone needs to, work hard to be rich or move to rich countries so that we can be protected? What are specific things that poor societies can do in phase one so that phase three of those disasters isn't so disastrous?
Right. So, well, in phase one, of course, protection is paramount. But I don't want to sound pessimistic, because all pessimists say they're just realists. There are acts of nature that are so extreme that nothing we can do is going to prevent them. I mean, we can't take down every building in New York and put it up again made out of titanium. There are things that are just going to be beyond us. So my concern is what happens afterwards. It's all about how to get back as quickly as you can and as reasonably as you can. And I think oversight and clear regulations about how you work after the fact is really important, because if you don't do it correctly, you'd simply set the scene for another disaster. It's a bit like not doing peace building correctly. If you don't build a sound peace, you're asking for another war. If you don't do the right thing after a disaster, you're asking for another disaster.
And let's also talk about the fact that these kinds of disasters are likely to happen more and more and more as we are experiencing severe climate change. You know, it is happening as we speak. And the powers that be, if you will, those who have the money are preparing. They are adapting because they have the money to begin with. We see these kinds of questions that you're bringing up being raised in climate conferences. They are not taken seriously. People are attempting to organize. The question is, how can that organization be effective? Do you hope that your book will contribute to these dialogues that take place in these conferences where policies can actually get made?
Well, I hope so. Let me begin with earthquakes, particularly from where you are. The earthquakes are not increasing, even though every time there is one, somebody is bound to say it seems like earthquakes are increasing. They're not. In fact, if anything, very, very long term, they should probably be decreasing. There are more people, and since a disaster is the effect on societies, effect on people, the more people there are, the more human disasters there'll be, even if there are no more earthquakes. So there's a way in which a rising population will always lead to more disasters if the physical phenomena don't change. Certainly, as climate changes, the simplest way to think of it is just that if you're heating something up, you're putting more energy in the system. So the more energy in the system, the more vigorously the system will, its dynamics will behave. So you can expect more extremes. Now, right now, the evidence for there being more extremes is not very strong, but it's reasonable theory to think that there'll be more extremes. And the fact that sea level will rise is incontestable. Then your point, who is going to be able to manage under those circumstances? Well, in the same way, it'll be people who have the resources to adapt, to protect, perhaps to move. You know, maybe the place where they live will become unbearable, but they'll have the means to move somewhere else and do well in, you know, the few refuges on the planet where things are still reasonably livable. And then, you know, the rest of us will have to try to make do in more harsh situations. So what I unfortunately think might happen is that the planet we live in today, which is showing increasing inequalities, climate change is just going to exacerbate the existing inequalities.
So one of the things that we didn't get to that we should have was that even within rich countries where there are hotspots of poverty, such as in New Orleans, and where racism multiplies the effect, we see mini disasters happening, such as we did in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Doesn't ultimately the conversation that we need to be having also have to do with income equality and simply equalizing people's means and ability to live?
Yes. What happens is very often that the media concentrates first on the physical damage, then gets a bit bored with that because, you know, you can't keep showing the same fallen down buildings night after night. And then in a way that's almost lucky for the media, some sort of antisocial behavior will begin or be manufactured, some sort of looting, and the media pivots immediately to that. And that becomes a story. You know, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And of course, the people that they're worried about, what can be described as the underclass, right? They're worried about the poor people, typically black people in New Orleans, rising up against the elites and stealing things from their houses. Now, that's a form of elite panic. It's not the common people that are panicking. They're just trying to make do. but the elites start to worry about whether the common people are going to take over. And that's when the army gets called in. That's when the National Guard gets called in, not to help save people, but to save property.
Exactly. And so, yeah, there certainly needs to be a cultural shift as well. Well, Jon, your book is called The Disaster Profiteers. And in your work as both a natural scientist and a social scientist, finally, do you have any hope for how we approach disasters? And that's, of course, a question to the social scientist hat that you wear.
I don't think it's that difficult to introduce a sufficient measure of oversight in the post-disaster period to do things correctly and not permit social inequalities to be taken advantage of. I think there's enough history in post-war reconstructions. There should be enough history in reconstructions following financial crises, which are a little bit different. Even though the economy loses a lot of value, it doesn't lose property. Whereas in natural disasters, the loss is always in capital stock. It's buildings and roads and other sorts of infrastructure, and less in terms of the value of the overall economy.
Well, Jon, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and spending time discussing your book.
Well, thank you very much.
My guest is Jon C. Mutter. He is the author of The Disaster Profiteers, How Natural Disasters Make the Rich Richer and the Poor Poorer. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com, and our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.